Hey there YouTube, we're back again with the Tekno SCT410.3 build, team build. This is bags I through K. It's going to be a short video because there really wasn't that much different from the manual build to what the team build recommendations are. So we start off with bag I, which is building up the bell crank for the steering system. And the upgrade that the team build recommends is changing out the stock plastic Ackerman plate with the aluminum Ackerman plate. So a couple of things that I always try to build up on my racers, and that's having a nice solid tight steering setup, right? So that means the steering arms, the Ackerman plate, any of the towers that are part of the bell crank system, the servo arm, the servo retention system, however that's done in there. If there are more rigid than plastic options, I tend to go for all of those because I want to have as little flex as possible in the steering system. For a basher, you actually want some flex because when things get hit real hard, you want them to be able to flex and move on with that, where precision isn't necessarily more important than rigidity and durability. So as you increase stiffness and rigidity, you also increase precision, but you also decrease durability because like a reed in the wind, bending is better than snapping. So but on a race truck, precision, and hopefully we drive better than me and we don't snap the metal stuff or the carbon stuff. At any rate, this is the upgrade. As you can see, half of the bell crank system is metal, right? So you got a metal tube here. The other side is plastic. I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem. This is the servo saver component here. It does come with some sealed and some standard metal shielding bearings. There's a rubber O-ring that we're going to need to put some shock grease on, like a green slime or something along those lines. But basically this is what we've got going on. So once you build up this, the thing I wanted to point out that I did slightly differently from what the manual calls for is on this servo saver spring tensioning ring, right? It calls for thread lock on this, and then the rubber O-ring gasket sets into here. Now I did put some green slime on this rubber O-ring as it's to make it lubed up and help it retain its flexibility and stuff over time. But I took I've got a Pilot silver paint pen, a fine tipped silver paint pen, and I drew a silver line in the middle of one of these ridges here, just one silver line, and I aligned that up, and I drew that line after you tighten it all the way down. So the manual calls for you to tighten it all the way down and then back it off 3 turns. So that's how you get the tension on your servo saver spring. So what I did was I tightened it all the way down, and I discovered that this little bit of ridging, right, aligned with this ridge on the servo saver arm. So I drew that line. I filled this one line in with silver paint with that silver paint pen, let it totally dry, and then I backed it off 3 turns, and that's how I knew I got exactly 3 turns on this back. And then this is what the bell crank system looks like when it's all built up. So we've got our metal Ackerman bar here, and all of our bearings and stuff are all put together. And then this is what it looks like from the back side. So I found that most of the parts they've nipped the little nubs off the part sprue pretty well, but in some cases I've gotten my files out, so you can kind of see a little bit of filing here where I've removed the remainder of the excess plastic from where the factory nipped the part off the part sprue. And then this is just a better shot with the flash. So moving on to bag J, again with these guys that are building this must have uber long shafts on their hex drivers because all of these bumper installs are really whacked. So as you can see, trying to install the front bumper, I ran into the same problem that I had with the back bumper in that my hex shaft was just too short. So rather than try to build it the way the manual states, oh yeah, here's a better picture of that. So this is also at an angle, right? So I tried to angle this up so you guys could see it best, but the straight line would put the screwdriver shaft like down here somewheres. So not only is it difficult to screw all the way in, but at least with my screwdrivers, the angle is jacked up, so you run the risk of stripping out the hex head. So in my opinion, this is just you don't do this. What I did was I installed this part here, which is, what part number is this? Let me take a quick look. It doesn't say what part number it is in the manual. The parts themselves aren't generally numbered unless there's an hop-up option. All they number are the screws. But at any rate, this little oval-shaped shock absorber part of the bumper, to do that second, right? So you put that on and then do the bumper second, so that you can actually reach in and screw this into the shock tower. That's how I did it. Now, here's a deviation from the manual. So this part number here, which of course this front bumper is not labeled in the manual, is different in the kit than what came even with my printed manual. So in the printed manual, this part doesn't exist. It kind of has a recessed part that attaches into the chassis plate. So there are no screws here on the bottom. And then you're supposed to screw a screw in from the front. Okay, now a couple of things that I found with this is, one, clearly this is a different setup. So you have to, if you installed your front end together and put all your screws in, you probably would be better off not to tighten them all the way down. See, I left a little bit of slack to them, so that when you go to put your front bumper on, you can remove those and then screw them down through the front bumper. So these front two screws should not go through the chassis plate into the front end like they show in the manual, because the manual has a different bumper than what comes in the kit now. So there's that, which is kind of nice. I mean, this adds a bit of a skid plate to the front end that didn't exist when the kit was first produced, so yay for that. The downside to doing this upgraded front pillow ball holder block thing, I think it's block A, is that the screw that goes through here just hits empty air, right? It's supposed to thread into the plastic block, right? But we've got an aluminum block, and there's no screw threads here. So unless I'm missing something, and please, if you're watching this and you know better, please let me know in the comments, but there's no screw here holding into the front because there's nothing for it to thread into. So don't try to put the screw in. So the back side of the steering arm, you've got a recession here for the nylock nut to go into. So it tells you to use some washers. So you want 2 washers on the top of the steering arm, and then 2 washers below the steering arm, and then the plastic of this, in case that wasn't 100% clear in the manual. And then once you get this tightened down, and now what I discovered was this nylock nut is very rugged, and I used a nut driver to fully seat this into here, even though the nut driver itself only had a little bit of thread or hex left to bite into because of the crown part of the nylock nut. The plastic of this wasn't quite sturdy enough to hold this nut in place as it started to thread down in. So I would recommend, when you're putting this together, have a nut driver on this nut side, and then use your hex driver on the opposite side and crank them like this to slowly bring those together. And that way the hex wrench, or the nut driver on the back side, will hold this nut in place. So the key is to make sure that as you're doing that, you have the slots and peaks aligned properly, so that you don't have the nut cockeyed going peak to flat, and then you'll really mess this up. So little tip, pay real close attention to that when you're using this method. Now, bag K. One of the things that I really try to keep the most rigid. On my son's low C, I went ahead and upgraded to the king head, center diff, the entire front and rear mount and top plate. All that is aluminum on his truck. But I wanted to see what came stock with this truck. I was hoping that the entire thing was aluminum, although I figured that it wasn't. So the front motor mount plate here is aluminum. Yay. The rear portion of the center diff housing is plastic, and then the upper portion and the top plate are plastic. So you need to use thread lock on anything threading into metal, okay, and no thread lock on things threading into plastic. There is an option part for the bottom brace of the center diff housing. You can get an upgrade to aluminum. I probably would have done that had I known straight out of the gate. Had I fully read the manual and in complete detail, I would have known that going out of the gate. I'm going to go ahead and run it stock. We're going to see how that holds up. Majority of the torque and tension is going to be on this front plate anyways, because this is where the motor is at, so it needs extra rigidity to hold the motor to keep it from twisting. With this metal plate in place, I'm hoping that it won't cause any twisting in the center diff. So we'll have to see how well this holds up, the plastic holds up. Maybe I will upgrade it in the future. And this is what it looks like when it's all built up. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind when you're putting this together is that the bearings seat well within this center diff housing. What I found is, because it's plastic, and let me back it up just a little bit, you can see that the ridges here are very, very small. These are the ridges that hold the bearings in place. So they're very small. So you want to just pay close attention when you're putting this center diff together with the entire diff housing, that you get those bearings lined up nice and square. Give it a good spin to make sure that it's square and smooth, and no binding or anything like that. And that's pretty much it. Everything else went together as per the manual. I did put an O-ring inside the outdrive of the center diff, the forward facing one, in between the drive shaft inside of here. I would have put one on the backside as well had I had one, but I don't think it's necessarily as important on the backside because this drive shaft is so short. This drive shaft is extremely long. There's a lot of back and forth movement, which will allow the chassis to flex without buckling your drive shaft, so you need to have some space for that drive shaft to wiggle back and forth. But it just had a little bit too much for me, so I put just a tiny little O-ring from, I don't know where I got it from, and I don't even know what size it is. I had a bunch of red, probably came from my Tamiya kits. I had a number of white silicone ones. I had some purple ones from Team Durango, and I had one lone black O-ring. And it was the perfect external diameter. So it was slightly bigger than the majority of the O-rings that I have. So I'm going to guess that the majority that I've got are 1 millimeter smaller than this particular one black one that I have. So I know that's not super helpful for you guys, but if you're going to do that, when you drop that O-ring down in, I needed to use my tweezers, the backside of my tweezers here, to get it perfectly flat and flush inside of that outdrive here on the frontward facing part of the center diff. The red ones would just fall out, and the white ones would, when I pushed them in, they would pooch up and they wouldn't lay totally flat. But that one particular black one just dropped right in. It was the exact size that I had to press it in. It wasn't going to fall out, but it wasn't pooching up or getting deformed. So that's what I went with. Hopefully that will provide a little bit of extra shock protection and protect the center diff from any chassis flexion of having that drive shaft jam into the center diff when the chassis flexes under large jumps or terrible landings, or who knows what abuse I'm gonna put this truck through. So just hopefully a little bit of extra added durability there for the center diff. And maybe even act a little bit of a shock absorber for the drive shaft as well, hopefully, so that this doesn't maybe bend in a terrible crash. I don't know if that's a thing that happens on these trucks, but I can see the physics working that could happen. So up next, the next video will be the shocks, and they are quite different than the manual, and there's a ton. I probably put more hop-ups into these shocks than anything else in this rig. So this next build, bag L and M, are the shock bags, and that's going to probably be the longest video of the bunch, building up these shocks. So thank you for watching. If you find this video useful and helpful, please leave a like. If you got any questions or comments, please go ahead and leave those. I try to respond to the people as quickly as I see the comments.